Hey everyone. So in this video, I want to cover another one of the principles for writing and reading. Specifically, I want to tackle what is called the Scenic Principle. So by the end of this video, you should be able to define the principles of the Scenic Principle, and you should be able to define or apply those properties to improve your own academic literacy. Again, your ability to read and to write. Why do you need to do this? Because the Scenic Principle is actually fairly important. It's a lot of movable elements that are often adding additional information that's not necessarily essential, but is important. And so as you're summarizing things, as you're trying to read quickly, these are things that you could potentially skip over. But as you're writing, these are also things that can move around in your own writing to try to add emphasis. So what is the Scenic Principle? It's a little confusing, but it's basically this: that you want to put movable text, that is words, phrases, and clauses, first to set the scene and to vary your sentence structure, if you want. But if you're not going to do that, you want to put the subject first. It's also a little bit more complicated because you could also put movable text last if you want to emphasize it. You could also put it somewhere in the middle if it's not that important. But it's basically about moving movable text so that it varies your sentence structure and that it highlights your meaning. So you can see it in this too, because I could just move this around and you'll see it. To set the scene and vary sentence structure, put movable text, i.e. words, phrases, and clauses first. Otherwise, put the subject first. You see it in action. I've taken this phrase right here to set the scene and vary sentence structure. It's movable. I could move it around in the sentence. I could put it first, last, somewhere different. And it enhances my meaning. It changes my meaning. So you can see here how I'm trying to kind of emphasize it a little bit more. If you don't like it, put it somewhere else. Again, this movable text is called a free modifier. We talked about it a little bit in the proximity video, but it's here again. It's something that can move around, and it's often, as you'll see here, when you move it, especially if you put it at the beginning, you offset it with commas. Usually at the end, you can see here, doesn't get commas. Middle or beginning gets commas. Okay, so let's look at some examples from a book chapter called The Models of Reading Comprehension. And so we look at this sentence: according to the simple view of reading, reading comprehension is the product of decoding and language comprehension. As you can see here, this is the beginning. This is our setting, our Scenic Principle. I think you're all pretty familiar with the according to. You can put it at the beginning. You can also put it at the end if you want to emphasize it differently. If you want to put some emphasis on reading comprehension as the subject, you can do that. And if you want to put emphasis on according to the simple view of reading at the end, you can do that too. Again, it's up to you. You can also see it in another sentence, maybe a little bit more complicated. The second component, originally labeled linguistic comprehension, stuck in the middle, and you can see, because it's in the middle, we're putting it off with commas, deals with how meaning is derived from text once it has been decoded. So again, we can take this movable font, or movable text, my bad, and we can move it to the beginning. Originally labeled linguistic comprehension, comma, because again, if it's coming at the beginning or the middle, we put commas around it. If it's at the end, no comma. The second component deals with how meaning is derived from the text once it's been decoded. Again, we're not really changing much of the sentence. It doesn't really make sense to put it at the end, so you can play around with it to see where it makes sense, but if it doesn't make sense, don't do it. And we can look here and see where an example kind of doesn't work to move things around, where that movable font, or that movable, I don't know why I keep saying that, that movable text sort of falls apart if we move it to the end because it just sort of throws off our meaning. If we look at this sentence, finally, the product term in the simple view of reading implies that if either component, decoding or linguistic comprehension, is 0, then, they're not saying then, but reading comprehension cannot occur because the product will be 0. So if you don't know how to decode a word, or you don't have the linguistic comprehension, you don't know have like the vocabulary or stuff like that, you just can't read. But if we try to move it around and say here, like the product term in the simple view of reading implies, finally, that reading comprehension cannot occur because the product will be 0 if either component, decoding or linguistic comprehension, is 0. It kind of makes sense. But we have to think a lot harder about that sentence than we do about the previous one. And if your reader has to think too hard, it's bad. Readers don't want to think hard. So again, if it's easy, like something like this, James Gee, a literacy theorist, has called culture a discourse, blah, 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 blah. We could shift that to the beginning. Literacy theorist James Gee has called blah, 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 blah. And you're gonna be like, Kellen, wait a minute. You put commas around it here, but not here. You said if it goes at the beginning, you do. there are some exceptions, and this is one of them. If you're using like what's called an appositive, a noun phrase to redefine a noun, if the more specific one comes first, like if I asked you to point to James G, or James G, you would know who to do. You would point to him in a room and there he is. But if I just said literacy theorist, you'd be like, I don't know who to point to. So here, literacy theorist is additional information because if you know who he is, you know that he's a literacy theorist. If you just say literacy theorist, you have to name a specific one for me to know who it is. So again, no comma here because this name is essential. Commas here because this isn't essential. And you can see another example here if we do like what's called an introductory clause. So from the years of teaching English to college students, comma, because it's at the beginning, traditional rule, Gerald Graff has identified the characteristics of academic discourse that serve as the biggest stumbling blocks to students' productive engagement. We could kick that to the end. I could even add some additional information because you might not know who he is. So, writing composition specialist Gerald Graff has identified the characteristics of academic discourse that serve as the biggest stumbling blocks to students' productive engagement, putting it at the end, no comma, from years of teaching English to college students. So again, movable stuff, I can move it around to where I think it makes the most sense. This isn't even the only example. Again, I could even move it here if I wanted to get really fancy with it. Writing composition specialist, Gerald Graff has identified from the years of teaching English to college students. Again, putting it in the middle, so it breaks my flow, separate it with commas. Making sense yet? I hope so. So let's start to review it. So let's start thinking about what are the properties of the Scenic Principle distilled down. So first, we want to remember that writers strategically use this to shift emphasis and potentially the meaning in a sentence. Remember how I'm moving those things around to try to call my reader's attention to different components of it. Writers use this strategically also to vary sentence structure. So that way you're not starting every sentence with, the same noun over and over again. The about principle says that we often keep, similar sorts of nouns in the front of our sentence. Well, this allows us to vary up that sentence structure so it's not boring and dumb. Writers also use this to combine simple sentences into complex sentences. Again, they're adding subordinate clauses to make these short sentences more complex, more rich. And finally, writers recognize how these can be captured in transition words as well, adding things like however, indeed, furthermore, moreover, just those short, simple words. And again, if they're at the beginning or the middle, putting them with commas. Usually if they're at the end, you don't need a comma. I don't really know what that's all about. Anyway, to review, we just want to remember, what is the Scenic Principle? Are you able to define it? That again, we want to move stuff around in our sentence to create emphasis. If we can put something first to set the scene, we should do that. But you don't have to. You can put it at the end too. Put it in the middle. Who cares? It's up to you. You're the reader or the writer. But we want to think about how it connects to the aboutness principle and the emphasis principle. How putting it at the beginning of a sentence might shift the aboutness of it, or putting it at the end might shift the aboutness of it. We also want to think about how the Scenic Principle relates to reading. As you're reading, pay attention to those scenic elements that could be moved around. Are they at the beginning? Are they at the middle? Are they at the end? Why might the writer put them where they've put them? And then finally, you can think about, one more too. When do you use the Scenic Principle when you are writing? How are you thinking about this movable text that you could put at the beginning, the middle, or the end to, play around with our attention? And then finally, what confuses you the most about this? And if there's anything you wish you understood better, as always, just email me at kbolt@elgin.edu, and I will see you in our next video.